On, and I bring good tidings from the outside world. We do have a new president in the United States officially. So, hey, look at that. And that's just happened in the last 10 minutes. So that's something to start off with. But as Leon has rightly said, we're going to have a little bit of a panel talking about games, brands, everything you need to know about it, everything you need to know about building one, and just making sure that you make the most of it for your business, because it's a really important part of what you need to do to be successful, but it can be a bit tricky to get it done. So rather than listen to me wittering about it, though, we've got some actual experts, which is always very reassuring. So I'm going to very quickly throw over to our two key experts to give them a chance to introduce themselves. I'm going to go and jump over to Oscar first. Oscar, would you like to give us the lowdown, Oscar?
Hello, my name is Oscar. I am the marketing lead at ustwo Games, which you might know us from the Monument Valley series and more recently Alva, a Wildlife Adventure. Before that, I was at Amazon Game Studio specifically, and I was the European marketing manager for basically all their games, because it's a very, I guess, young part of the company. And yeah, been here for a couple of years now.
Fantastic. And Andrew, what's going on in your world?
I am the CMO and co-founder of a business called Intorqa.
So we've managed to get that from Andrew at least. So I think the important thing is, while Andrew presumably reconnects, I think I'm just going to chuck over to you, Oscar, and start you off with a question. Oh, he's back. Hang on, you're back, Andrew.
Oh, where did you lose me?
We managed to get to your Andrew from Intorqa.
Oh, was that it?
That's about it, yes.
So I missed the important bit about what we do, because we've only been around 12 months. Yes, we're a gaming intelligence platform which reduces cheating for developers and publishers by monitoring thousands of vendors and forums and such. Hopefully you can still hear me. Before that, I was at Barclays. Prior to that, British Gas, and then prior to that, a long time working in advertising agencies.
Fantastic. Yeah, we did get that all this time, so that's really
just
fantastic.
Shout if you don't.
Exactly. I'll shout at any point, but I think I'm going to go in just with a question. I'm going to start this off with Oscar, which is thinking about brands and just trying to sort of get to the bottom of what they actually are. You know, when you're thinking about a brand, what are you actually thinking that is? What does it represent?
I think there's a couple of ways to think about it. Well, there's a million ways to think about it, but I think the basic thing that everybody thinks of is, the logo and the name and that basic representation of your company. So basically something that everybody can point to and say, oh, I know what this is, this and associate it with an organization or a product. But I think as a wider idea, everything really interacts with the brand. So it's not just the logo and the name, but every little interaction that a customer, player, whatever you want to call them, has with your organization, that is also part of your brand. So it's that idea that kind of ethereal idea that people associate with your organization.
So there's the kind of the practical components of a brand, like you say, so the assets and the things that go into it. But realistically, for you, it's about trying to convey an idea, right?
Yeah, I mean, in a very stupid sense, like when you watch the Apple keynote speech like conference, every single presenter there is communicating that brand through their body language, which is why they take so much care of that. So any little interaction that somebody has with your your company, it does play into your brand. Yeah.
Of course. And Andrew, what do you make of that? What's your experience when you're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly. I mean, people often kind of, as Oscar was saying, they think first and foremost of a logo, but a brand is much more than that. And I kind of, as you say, you've got the practical bits, but actually the important thing is that a brand, for me, is, it's the idea. As Oscar said, it's called it the idea. For me, it's the promise, because that is what a brand ultimately is. It's a promise from a business to a user. And that goes back to when brands first started, when they were, basically they were the sort of the marks on the backsides of cattle. That was the first brand. And it was telling you, it was doing two things, actually. It was it was promising to meet some expectations. And actually it was an IP, effectively. It was saying, that's a cow from this farm, not from that farm. Don't try to rip me off. That's what brands, and actually, in some respects, it's not changed. It's about a promise. And, the key things it helps people, it embodies a load of expectations and a story, which enables people to choose one brand versus another. And that, the classic example of that is an FMCG, where you're faced with lots of different ones, lots of different detergents. One stands for this, one stands for this, but with a bit of this. And back to actually what Theodora says, often an emotional meaning that people will drive people to choose one over another. But yeah, it's the promise, and it's brought to life across absolutely everything. And and I thought that the previous talk around benefits is a brilliant example of that. Actually, benefits, a brand has to be brought to life across absolutely every touch point, internally as well as externally. And benefits is a brilliant way of doing that internally.
And so, Andrew, just as a sort of a follow up on those points there, to me, like the things I'm pulling out from you is you're talking about brand as basically something that's closely attached to what your intellectual property is, a brand as something that stands out, that defines what you are. It's that idea, it's those values it encompasses. So I'm going to take a guess how you're going to answer this next question, but how important is a brand then?
Well, in a way, it's as important as a business makes it, because in a way, brands are obviously incredibly important to businesses. I mean, there's the sort of stories around how much when P&G bought Duracell, they basically were paying for the brand. I think 60% of the value was actually intangible assets, and that was the brand they were buying. But so they are incredibly important from a value point of view to a business. They nowadays they command huge values. But at the same time, they are only as important as a business as a business wants it to become, because businesses can, if they fail to invest in a brand, they will just end up owning a product, and it will be and actually it won't even be a product, it'll be a commodity in the end, because it won't actually stand for anything with the customer. And it won't stand out against the competition. So, and then you'll end up with something which isn't that important to the business. And you can sort of see businesses which have made that mistake over years, where you have people, and I've worked in them, where people have gone, I don't really think we need a brand. And it's actually what they're saying, what they really mean is, I don't think we need to invest in branding, because you're going to have a brand. As soon as people know your name, you've got a brand, whether you like it or not. It's just whether you choose to manage it properly.
That's a really interesting point, and it's going to be something that I'm going to throw over to Oscar now, which is about, if there's people on here who are thinking, I'm building a business, maybe it's got a brand already that I'm defining, or maybe it's the case that, we're just literally starting out, but people are starting to associate things with us. How do you actually go about cultivating that brand? What kind of process do you have to go through to actually build that from scratch, so that you've got something that goes beyond just being some things that people associate you with to being something that's defined?
I think that last point was really good. If you're talking about the resources you want to throw at it, I think you can do a lot with a little, in the sense that just because you want to define a brand doesn't mean you have to spend millions on the best designer to get a logo. I think what you can start with is trying to define the brand in whatever way is meaningful to you. So everybody is a bit different. I think you can start about it. Some people are very visual and have an immediate idea visually. And then in that sense, you can define that any way you would define a visual identity for anything that you've ever done. So whether it's a mood board or something like that, something that gets what emotions and ideas you want to put into place. Another way to do it, if you're more, I guess, less visual and a bit more into words, you can start throwing out words. Like, it depends, however you like to come up with an idea. That's usually a good way. So things that we've done in the company are, brainstorm sessions. Some people like the idea of like, we are the X of Y, or another way, which is a bit of a cheat, is coming up with things that you are not and then flipping it around. But the important thing with both of the last two I've mentioned is to never stick to, we are the X of Y, because nobody wants to hear that, or say that, oh, we're not about this. I think the really important thing is that once you have defined a series of values or ideas or promises, as Andrew mentioned, that you make sure that you're talking about what you are about. So say, for example, you're not about, low quality. You would never talk about, no, we're not about products that break. We are about long lasting products, or that's the promise of like, you'll never have to come to us with repairs or something like that. And yeah, those are different ways that we've gone about defining a brand.
Of course. And just as a little follow-up there, it's something actually that we were talking about briefly over email before we came into this, which was about when thinking about brands, especially for games companies and maybe publishers as well, you might have the brand for the studio, for the publisher, for the company, but then the games themselves are going to have a brand identity of their own. How important is it to try and keep those two things aligned? You know, is it the case that you can actually go off in quite a different direction and it's all going to hold together? Or is it one of those things that you actually have to be thinking carefully about as a business, how the brand of your games line up with the brand of what your business is doing?
I guess the answer depends on the person that needs to hear it. So if you're the kind of person that overthinks everything, then I probably should tell you, don't worry about it too much. Like, just, you know, do your thing. But if you're the kind of person that never thinks about it, no, there needs to be consistency. So in general, I think the best way to think about it is, yes, you need a brand for your games, but you need a separate brand for your company. That separate brand sometimes can be the same. So you often see companies that double down on their I guess IP of a game, and it's not just about the game, but about the different possibilities of that IP. But in general, you should try to define what those two things are, and then you can always change it in the future as well. And you should change it, especially if your studio brand stops being consistent. So for example, for us, we have this issue a lot, right? We are known for Monument Valley and Land's End, which were these surreal games about, you know, worlds that can never exist, and that, you know, they were very much, you know, minimalist in the way that they tell you the story. And then we've come out with two games in the past 2 years, Assemble with Care and All About Wildlife Adventure, which if you thought that was what we stood for, then you'd think, I don't know where this come from, because they're it's about the menial everyday interactions and very real people and very grounded games. So those two don't make sense if you thought our company was stood about games that are surreal. But we then took it last year and thought, what do we really stand for? And we came out with, you know, we tried to bring what's meaningful about games to everybody. So really, it's not about the visual identity of these two different games. It's about what we want to do overall, and then how those games fit into that overall brand.
Yeah, it's a fascinating point, because you know, one of the things I would say, in probably hopefully a profound compliment for you, is that I would say that actually every Us 2 game feels like an Us 2 game whenever I've played them. Like they might have quite a different visual identity, but they really feel as if it's one thing that this studio has worked on. And so, going to you, Andrew, and talking a little bit further about developing those brands and developing something potentially of your own that's going to hold up like that. You know, what kind of tools or techniques do you recommend for people to use as well?
I think it's, I mean, the sort of, I mean, actually, just going back to the previous question, I think if you're in a business, one of the most important questions is, what do you want the brand to be? So do you want it to be in gaming? Is it the game? Or is it the studio? You know, and it's a very similar point. I think TV stations are a great analogy for this, because if you look at someone like HBO, you can kind of get an HBO program. So you know it's an HBO program pretty quickly, but the majority of TV stations aren't like that, because they put all the money, they invest, they make the programs the brand, if you see what I mean. Do you know what I mean? So neither one is necessarily right or wrong, but I think the key thing is to know which way you're going to go. Because if you don't know, then you're going to get confused and then you waste loads of money. So you need to decide where you want to build the brand is the first question. But in terms of techniques, I mean, listen, the key thing with building brands, like any marketing, is the customer. That's your starting point, has to always be the customer. You know, what are they? Who are they? What do they like? What do they need? What gap in the market or what gap in their lives are you going to fill? And, you know, so that is all about insight. So customer insight is probably, I'd say it's kind of, is number one. I then think, you know, and there are lots of ways of bringing a brand to life in an organization, and then for people to bring to life them, you know, typically the marketing teams or customer service teams or whatever, when they bring it to life for users. And there's lots of important in this brand strategy. There's visual identity, et cetera, et cetera. For me, the key thing is brand personality. And I think brand personality is probably the thing that is the biggest driver of strong brands. You know, if you look at someone like Nike, for example, they actually have a pretty inconsistent visual identity. I mean, they've got all these kind of almost sub brands, if you like, they've almost become sub brands across the different sports and things like that. But, you know, they treat football very different to how they treat, and talk about soccer there, very different to how they would treat golf or tennis. But it's the attitude is consistent across. Doesn't matter what sport they're talking about. You've still got the same Nike, just do it. Don't accept no, etc. for an answer. All those kind of attitudinal sort of personality traits will come through. So that's, I think, absolutely critical. And then, the other thing is test and learn. I think it's like with all marketing, it's about, trying new things. I think brands can quite quickly get very stuck. I mean, consistency is important for bringing a brand to life for most brands, because otherwise people, particularly when they're starting out, because it is about repetition, effectively, so people remember you. But you don't get too stuck in a rut. And for another, you need to be able to adapt over time. You also need to be able, particularly, I have to say, a global business like gaming, you need to be able to certainly adapt how you bring the brand to life for different markets.
Well, so this is the thing. I'm interjecting here because we've actually just gotten a question in from the Q&A, which is almost exactly about this. So it's from Sam C, and he was asking about how you can ensure that overseas partners respect and adhere to your brand values. So, for example, you license your game to an overseas publisher. So we're kind of going off in that direction. What do you make of that question, Andrew?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting, and it depends how close you are to those overseas partners, and every relationship will be different. And can you hear me, by the way?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, you can. So you frozen on my screen, so I got one. But it depends on, the relationships will be different. But, I mean, the first thing is to build a strong relationship with those overseas partners so that they understand you. The second thing is to make sure they understand the brand, and they need to understand what it stands for, what it means, and have the guidelines and the tools in which to bring that brand to life as to how you'd want it. But I think the key thing is this coming from an agency background where you have that sort of relationship all the time. You have a central agency and then a local one, a satellite one, or whatever. I've been on both sides, and there is nothing worse than being the satellite and basically being given something and just told to go and do it. It's kind of pretty demoralizing. Particularly in any kind of if there's an industry with any sense of creativity. So you want you need some room for flexibility, and you do, whatever people say, different regions there are different levers to pull, even if it's just media, for example, but there are different levers to pull across different markets and, across the globe. So I think it's always important to listen to the local markets, and then agree between you the best way of bringing to life that brand in those markets. Again, I always go on about Nike, but they do this fantastically well. I mean, frankly, most not brand questions, I think the answers usually go to what Nike does, genuinely, because as a global brand, no one, I don't think, has got close to how they manage their brand around the world in a way which is both consistent and plays to their strengths in different markets.
No, exactly.
And they're truly global. I mean, there's not many that are.
Exactly. And I think your point as well about, talking about overseas partners, I think that dialogue is essential because, I used to, back in a distant age, was writing a lot about adapting games for China's market and thinking about, things like actually looking towards the kinds of things that Chinese players really identify with and what culturally works. So, there's a lot in there, for example, about the fact that actually they really like characters based on mythology, based on the history of the country, and that you will get that kind of insight, but you need to make sure that you don't just suddenly go, right, I'm just going to go and shove a load of Chinese mythology characters into my game, because that's not going to work. But it does touch me on another point, which I think is important, and I think Oscar might be quite good for answering as well, which is about how do you keep everyone on track as well with the kind of like the brand values? Because, I mean, using the right creative, using the right language, what kind of things essentially do you need to have that you can hand out to people so that everyone can be on the same page?
It's a great question. And to be honest, if we're talking about how, since Nike keeps coming up, a global, multinational does it, I honestly, I'm surprised that they're able to do that. But I think the main thing that you can always go back to is make sure that you know what it stands for before you can expect anybody else to understand. Because if you don't, then everybody's going to get mixed messages from you. But if you have a very clear idea of what the brand stands for, then you make sure that the core, talk about a growing company, or like our company, for example, we're only 30 people. If we know that the core group understands it, and because you've had discussions about it, people can ask questions, then you make sure that they live that brand as well. And whenever somebody new comes into the organization, you can share I mean, it depends on how you want to do it. We have a very nice presentation, and we make sure that Danny Gray, who's our chief creative officer, he makes sure, like, he gives that presentation to people whenever they join. But yeah, we can do that because we're a 30-person organization. If I suddenly have to think about, you know, how I would do this if I have satellite offices everywhere in the world, then it becomes harder. I don't know if you have any ideas on that, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I think empowerment is a critical thing, and it's about empowering people with training so that they understand the brand, and that not every decision has to go to a brand team or a creative director or whatever. Because, you know, particularly particularly when you're looking at this from a global point of view, people need to be able to input. People need to understand the brand well enough that they can get it pretty much 99% right. Do you know what I mean? As opposed to kind of it just going veering off course all the time. And it's just as it is with partners, dialogues is absolutely important. I mean, I think it's so easy for businesses, particularly as they get bigger, not to put enough time into internal stakeholder relationships and colleague relationships. You get that right, everything else will flow out of that.
Fantastic. And so just to round things off, we've got 1 minute left. So I'm just going to ask you both just one final quick top tip for you in relation to brands. For Andrew, I mean, I might guess that it might be go and look at what Nike's doing, but I'm wondering if there's...
I'm going to change. Are you coming to me first?
Yeah, I'm going to come to you first.
I mean, there's loads of tips. I mean, but I would say look around you. You know, when you're developing a brand, don't get stuck. And when you're just building the brand as well, keep looking around you, because things change, obviously, and it's very easy to sort of, you know, assume that because you finally cracked your brand, it's all nice for the business, it's all working, that you don't need to continually evolve it. And you need to be very outward looking, and not just, and also back to this global thing, look in other markets as well, see what's working in other markets, understand the context. Particularly in gaming, communities are key. So understand what is influencing your gaming community, and I don't think you'll go too far wrong.
Fantastic. And Oscar, one final word of wisdom?
I don't know if I should say consistency or authenticity, but I think both apply. If your brand values that you are telling everybody else are in contradiction with who you are as a company, and this goes back to the previous conversation about benefits as well, then I think now more than ever, people will go out for blood, and they can come to you for that. So if you have an aspirational brand, as in who you want to be as opposed to who you are, then make sure that you fix and whatever you need to fix internally so that you're consistent.
Fantastic. And with that, Oscar, Andrew, thank you so much. Leon,